Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll start the presentation soon. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to trickle in, and then we'll get started. So thank you so much for your patience. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining. For those who are just trickling in, we're going to give it about 1 more minute, and then we'll start the presentation. For those who are already here, again, thank you for your patience, and the presentation will start soon. All right, and it looks like we have a good number of people here, and we're ready to start. So I'll hand it off to Dawn, who will kick off this presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are going to go over the draft fiscal year 2026-2028 Tribal CCDF Plan, which sounds so far away, and yet it's not. It was just released in the Federal Register, and so we're going to walk through that with you all today. My name is Dawn Ramsberg. I'm the Director of the Program Operations Division in the Office of Child Care. And our staff in the office have been working incredibly hard over the past several months on this draft to put it out to go through the federal comment process. And the work that they have done in putting this draft together actually reflects input that we have received from our tribal lead agency over the past several years. So during the last plan submission, we received a lot of really helpful feedback. And then we also had a request for information out last year. And again, a listening session earlier this year at our National Tribal Conference. And with all of that feedback that we received, we really have looked at our approach to the tribal plan and hope that you see your comments taken into consideration and that we have been responsive to that incredibly helpful input and feedback. And so we look forward through this comment process that is getting underway. We look forward to hearing from you, what we got right. Hopefully we listened and we were able to show you how we took your feedback into consideration. But we also know there's more work to be done. And so there will be a second draft that comes later down the road. And so we will be able to continue to work on making the next draft even better. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Meryl Borofsky, who's in the Program Ops Division, to kind of take the webinar from here. But again, just thank you all for joining, and thank you for your feedback, and thank you for the team who's been working to put this draft together. So Meryl, take it away.
Thank you, Dawn. You can go to the next slide, please. So before we get started, we wanted to see who is on this webinar today. So if you, as we are introducing ourselves, if you could put in the chat box your name, title, the Tribal CCDF program, if you work with one, and then we're just curious how many Tribal CCDF plans you have been involved in writing. Is this going to be your first one? Have you been doing it for several plan cycles? And just to kind of gauge who our audience is today. You can go to the next slide. So today we're going to be talking through the draft tribal plan preprint. As Dawn said, my name is Meryl Borofsky. I'm a senior child care program specialist in our central office. And I'm joined here by several OCC colleagues. Patty Boldinger is a senior child care program specialist in Region 6. Sarah English is a child care program specialist in Region 8. Trina Gillum is a child care program specialist in Region 6. And Shar Shank is the director of the Tribal Program Support Center, which has been helping us with all of our revisions and work on this new draft. If we could go to the next slide, please. So at the beginning of this webinar, we kind of wanted to level set of what we are going to be talking about. There has been a lot of announcements from OCC that have gone out in the past week. And so we want to be really clear what today is for. So we really, on today's webinar, are hopefully going to increase your awareness on the release of this first draft of the federal fiscal year 2026-2028 tribal plan. That is open now for a 60-day comment period. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. What does that mean? We also want to encourage you all, and as well as your tribal leaders, other CCDF administrators, community members, to review the draft and submit comments on the plan. This is intended to be an informative webinar. It's not a training on the plan submission. That will happen later once we have a final plan. But this is really to inform you on the changes we've made so that you can provide us with comments as we prepare the next draft. I also want to note, even though this is in Zoom, we have so much to go over, we won't have time for questions. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, but we won't have time to respond to them today. You can also always reach out to your regional program manager, regional program specialists, which I'll talk about at the very end of the webinar. But we also do want to acknowledge, and I will have a couple slides at the end, that we did have an NPRM announcement that we'll be publishing next week. This webinar will not be focusing on that. We just don't want to address, we don't want to have confusion. That is also going to be out for public comment, but this webinar is really focusing on the tribal preprint. So we could go to the next slide, please. So as Dawn said, this is our first draft of the next tribal plan preprint. And just also want to say the plan is due every 3 years. And so the next time it'll be due will be 1 year, a little less than a year from now, July 1st, 2025. But anytime the federal government is collecting information from the public, we have to follow the Paperwork Reduction Act, which says that we have to put out drafts for public comment before putting out our final set of questions. So our first comment period is 60 days. This is our draft 1. This draft is open for comments until September 3rd. And once that closes, we in OCC will look at every single one of the comments. We will review them. We'll look at conflicting comments, and we'll make changes based on what we've received. And we'll put out a second draft. sometime in the fall. That timeline is a little fuzzy only because depending how many comments are, it might take us more or less time to make revisions. Our second draft will then be out for 30 days. We'll again collect all the comments received, respond to them, make any changes, and have a draft out in early 2025. Our goal is to have our final draft of this out no later than January, so that you all have a copy of the draft full 6 or 7 months before it is due. And at that time, we'll also publish our program instruction, which will provide instructions on how to complete the plan. You go to the next slide, please. So the purpose of the tribal plan, the CCDBG Act, our law and our regulations require that every 3 years, tribes as well as states and territories, although on a different cycle, submit a plan as part of their application for CCDF funds. The plan is a prospective look. So it's what are you planning on doing for the next 3 years? It describes your vision and goals for the CCDF program, and it allows OCC oversight of the CCDF program and implementation. This is not, as you all know, the only way that we collect information. So the ACF 700 and the 696T, which are program and financial reports that are due annually, those are retrospective. Like, what did you do in the last year? How many children did you serve, or how did you spend your funds? This is really looking forward over the next 3 years. This is what we hope to do with our program. You go to the next slide. I'm just going to talk in very broad terms about our overall refinement goals, and then we're going to go kind of specifically into each section for you all so you can see. So the first, if we could go to the next slide, the first place I just wanted to pause, we, as Dawn said, have done a lot of information gathering over the past couple of years, both with the plan as well as consultations, listening sessions. And we've tried to be very responsive of that feedback. And actually, this is a quote from the tribal consultation we had this week, which I think felt for the work group like very good, because hopefully our changes have addressing some of the concerns. So this quote was recommending the plan focusing more on what a tribe is doing as opposed to the process of how they're doing that. And I think as we talk through some of the changes, hopefully you'll see that throughout. If we could go to the next slide. We really, what guided a lot of the revisions in our in this draft are really the 2 recent executive orders that have been released. So one overall goal we had is to really reflect the trust in tribes and deference to tribal decision making. We, as you'll see and we'll talk about, really looked at balancing the narrative and checkboxes. We removed a lot of narrative options where we just asked for a tribe to certify that they are doing X, Y, and Z requirement, that, you know, we trust that the tribal lead agency will, you know, we don't need to know the process. We just need to know that you're doing it. And so you'll see that throughout. We also significantly reduced questions asking about those tribal processes. If we go to the next slide. The other executive order that helped guide our work that was released earlier this year is really looking at reducing the burden on federal reporting for tribes. And so, as you'll see in this draft, it is significantly shorter than the previous 2023-2025 preprint. And you'll see those kind of shift in questions, which is reducing the burden. So we removed all unnecessary questions and reduced the overall number of questions. We revised the plan for plain language and tried to be really clear about how to answer the question. So it's kind of clear in the instructions what's required in a response. We tried hard to be consistent in our language throughout. And then we also, if you'll notice the PDF, we tried to mimic what it'll look like in CARS for you all. So CARS is the system in which you submit your plan. And so we tried with this draft to include like the blue box around the questions that would kind of load together on the same page in CARS. So hopefully that'll also be helpful for you if you printed it out and you're filling, once CARS is open, you're filling out the plan. And you can kind of know what is expected to come together. We also streamlined the titles. Next slide, please. We also, just overall, as I've said, decrease the burden. Overall, we reduced the number of questions by 1/3 from the last plan cycle. And as you'll see, every section in the plan has fewer questions. But as I've said, we also kind of worked on reducing descriptions when descriptions weren't necessary. And so there are 200 fewer questions requiring a description. Sometimes this was an increase in like a certification or a yes, no. So certify that you are doing X, Y, and Z would replace a describe question that was in the past. So I think that the 34% reduction is actually deceiving. It doesn't look at really how much we really reduced, hopefully, the burden, just because we've converted a bunch of the questions to certification or a yes, no response. We go to the next slide, please. So finally, we revised the plan based on the new 2024 final rule for tribes. So as you've probably seen this slide before, there were some changes for tribal lead agencies with the new final rule and what's required. And so we just adjusted the questions based on the final rule. So if something looks different, it could have been that last plan cycle without that final rule, something was required where now it is not required. So you'll see those changes throughout. And with that, I am going to pass it to Patty to start talking through the first section of the plan.
Thank you, Meryl. And before we jump in, I just want to give a reminder that if you are a program that integrates your CCDF program into a Public Law 102-477 program, you provide a plan for your 477 program to the BIA, who shares it with the Office of Child Care. You are not required to submit the plan preprint. You do kind of intersect with the plan in terms of your triennial child count declaration, but just know that if you are a 477 grantee, your plan is an integrated plan. It is not this specific CCDF plan. And so with that, we'll jump into section 1, which covers overall program administration. As Meryl mentioned and Dawn mentioned, we really tried to listen to tribal leadership and to tribal lead agency through consultation and listening sessions that the Office of Child Care has had. And we heard that tribal nations wanted more opportunities to really share their stories, and the Office of Child Care wants to hear those. So you'll note as we walk through section 1 that we really attempted to honor that request as the plan was refined. Overall, in section 1, we're thrilled to say there was a 31% decrease in questions asked. We did add additional space to allow tribal agencies to upload a tribal seal. We added an optional space to allow tribal agencies to tell their stories. And we also moved the child count and the related definitions to the beginning of the section, recognizing the importance of that information in determining CCDF funding. We also added space to include primary fiscal contact information. We hope that this will help facilitate communication with the Office of Grants Management. And as with other contact information in the CCDF plan, it would be available to be updated outside of the plan amendment process. OCC added that change in the CARS system within the past year or so, and we feel it's added greatly to keeping contact lists updated, which then allows lead agencies and administrators to receive information more timely. We also moved a discussion on underserved populations to section 5, which is a section on stable childcare financial assistance. So now we're going to go through and we're going to actually look at some of the specific changes to the preprint in section 1. Meryl mentioned one of our goals was to kind of reduce the number of description questions and to add kind of more checkboxes to simplify things. In the past, tribal lead agencies were asked to provide detailed descriptions about their public hearing processes. Now you're simply asked to certify that you did hold at least one public hearing no earlier than 9 months before the effective date of your plan, and that you did provide 20 days notice of that hearing throughout your tribal service area. So it took a number of questions and reduced it simply to a check mark. Next slide, please. Section 1.7.1 was very challenging in the last plan preprint. It asked about the types of providers you had in your community, but it didn't really define the various types of care. So this refinement really asks about the 3 categories of care that are defined in the CCDF final rule. And again, it's simply a checkbox, and it's very focused on the definitions of categories of care in the rule. Next slide. This was an area we had a question about coordinating of services in the last plan. You'll see it on the left there. There were a number of checkboxes, all of which required a further description. We've eliminated all those checkboxes and said, describe your coordination efforts, really is what that question is. So again, a number of areas of description that have been eliminated and reduced to just one description box. Finally, in section 1, there was a section on the child care disaster plan components, and it had 5 different questions. In this draft, it's reduced to a simple yes or no certification for each of those areas. So again, we hope that section 1 has met some of our goals in terms of refining and reducing the administrative burden. Those are just some of the highlights of our changes and refinements, and I'm going to pass it on to section 2 with Sarah.
Thank you, Patty. So now we're going to talk about the proposed changes to the health and safety section of the plan preprint. As you review section 2, you will notice a 10% decrease in the number of questions throughout the section. The format of the questions were also adjusted to make it more friendly and easier to express the vision of the tribal nation. This resulted in a decrease of description questions and an increase of the yes or no questions that we've talked about so far. The Office of Child Care also recognizes that many tribal lead agencies may only be using relative providers, that they have chosen to exempt from some or all of the health and safety standards. The new format will significantly reduce the questions required in this situation. The same approach was used for tribal nations who are utilizing the state's comprehensive background check, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Next slide. So we're going to take a quick look at a few examples. In question 2.1.3, the question has been restructured to reflect the options that the tribal nation has in establishing health and safety standards for relative providers. As a reminder, relative providers are defined as grandparents, great-grandparents, siblings living in a separate household, aunts, and uncles who provide care to only family members. OCC recognizes that there are additional family relations, and these individuals may be deemed an eligible provider under other provider types. And that will be reflected in other questions in the plan. Next slide. So here's a few additional examples. Qualifications for inspectors or monitors to inspect facilities and providers was previously a narrative question and is now a yes or no attestation. The same for fees related to the completion of background checks. This is now a yes or no question as opposed to explaining the process you take as a tribal nation. Next slide. So for those of you who completed the 2023-2025 plan, you will undoubtedly remember the comprehensive background check table. It will go down in history, we have no doubt. You will be happy to know that the table has been simplified to this short checkbox of this checklist of boxes for you to tell us what approach you use. Next slide. If the simplification of the table was not enough reason to celebrate, as I mentioned in the overview, if you are utilizing the state system as your pre-approved method for comprehensive background checks, your answer becomes even more simplified. We simply ask you to tell us the states that you use. I am going to hand it over to Shar to talk about quality improvement.
Thanks, Sarah. Section 3, quality improvement, is the last section in part 1, which is for tribes of all allocation sizes. As you know, you can use quality funds for a broad variety of ways to improve the quality of childcare for children in your communities. And this is a great way to describe what you're doing or what you're planning on doing in the next plan cycle. So next slide. So the changes to this section include reducing the number of checkboxes from 89 to 10 checkboxes. Those 10 checkboxes represent the 10 allowable quality activities only. And we also removed 4 questions: evaluation of progress, specific training and professional development requirements, participation in the state's training and professional development system, and the culturally relevant trainings and professional development opportunities. This is resulting in a 71% decrease in questions for Section 3. Next slide. So on the slide, you're going to see basically one of the 2 questions, which lists all of the 10 quality activities that you may choose from. And within each of the checkboxes, you will find like the top 5 examples from the previous checkboxes. But don't worry, those checkboxes will become a CCDF resource for you as you write your plan, so they're not lost or forgotten. It's just that they're not in the plan at this point. We also wanted to mention this really will help clarify this section for tribal lead agencies as you think through what quality activities you'd like to choose. You're not required to choose all 10, and we want to make sure that you have the capacity to fulfill your goals and initiatives by just really choosing the ones that you want to invest in during this plan cycle. For the checkboxes that you do choose, you will be provided an opportunity to kind of tell your story of quality and what you plan on using those quality dollars for. Next slide. As you can see, a 71% decrease makes a 1-slide deal. So we'll move on to part 2. Part 2 of the plan is Section 4, direct services for tribal lead agencies with small allocations only. They have the flexibility to design their direct services if they choose to offer them that best meets the needs of the families and children in their community. So next slide. So this section has been reduced by 77% to allow tribal lead agencies with small allocations to describe their application process and the eligibility criteria that best fits their needs, as OCC recognizes that tribes receiving small CCDF grants may not have sufficient resources or infrastructure to effectively operate a program that complies with all CCDF requirements. So this used to have 15 optional questions before, and now it's reduced to 1 lovely description. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Trina.
Thank you, Char. Now we're going to go into part 3. This section covers Section 5, stable childcare and financial assistance. This section is also only for tribal lead agencies with medium and large allocation. So we're going to go directly into that, and we'll go to the next slide. In Section 5, we have decreased questions overall by 29%. You will also find that in this section, it has been reordered, and some questions changed to just certification. There's also an added describe question for the graduated phase-out process. And there were 2 questions removed. One was dissemination of information applying for childcare services. So you will no longer see those 2 questions. And some of you may recall or remember that in this section previously that there was building supply. There was a building supply question. That question has been moved to section 6. So again, overall, there has been a 29% decrease in section 5. So now we're going to show you some of those changes in the next slide. So here we did some detailed refinements around categorical eligibility. We clarified the combination of categorical eligibility and standard eligibility. So now you will see an optional checkbox and a narrative section to describe. So you'll see that in the plan. And we're going to go to the next slide to talk about the eligibility documentation. Eligibility documentation had 1 narrative for each element and asked for a determination and redetermination to be included. So now tribal lead agencies have the option to put NA if it is not applicable during that period for that lead agency. And then we're going to go to the next slide, which focuses on family contributions to payments. Family contribution to payments had 1 table and 7 questions. Now it is reduced to 1 yes or no and 1 checkbox and 1 description. So again, this confirms the reduction of the 29% overall for section 5. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. And she's going to talk about section 6.
Thank you, Trina. So we're going to continue through part 3, looking at equal access to quality childcare. Again, this section is specifically for tribal lead agencies who receive a medium and large allocation. Next slide. So this section has a 46% reduction in questions, including the removal of the provisions of grants and contracts, talking about methods to inform families of child care provider categories, tiered differential and add-on rates, and payment rates to support equal access. We also have removed 2 subsections, which are assessing child care market rates and implementing generally acceptable payment practices and ensuring timeliness of payments. So now let's look at a few of those questions. As illustrated on this slide, payment rate is now a yes or no question instead of a narrative of the approach used by the tribal nation in how you go about establishing and setting those rates. Next slide. For tribal nations that offer in-home care, question 6.2.4, describing any limitations placed on in-home care has been reduced to a yes or no checkbox as well, instead of walking through all of the different types and situations in which that may come into play. With that, that wraps up our section 6, and I will now pass it to Patty to walk us through family outreach and consumer education.
Thank you, Sarah. Section 7 is for tribal lead agencies with medium and large allocations to complete. And if you go to the next slide, we'll start talking about some of the overall refinements. You'll notice a theme if you haven't already. Section 7 was reduced from 61 questions to just 28. We reordered it to reflect how administrators first share consumer education with families and then how they provide follow-up. We took several description questions and revised them to yes or no certification type questions. You'll be glad to know in total, this section went down from 49 description questions to only 7. Some questions were combined and some definition questions that weren't required by the final rule were removed. Throughout the section, we reviewed language to ensure it was in plain language and easier to understand. So let's look at some examples. In the past, the plan required 4 narrative questions about the parental complaint process because our regulations do require a detailed description. But considering the goal of reducing questions, asking about tribal processes whenever possible, the 4 narrative questions have been combined into 1 narrative, and the rest of the requirements were revised to yes or no certification questions. Next slide, please. Looking at consumer and provider education, and provider information, certain CCDF requirements have multiple requirements. And in the consumer education section, OCC created multiple questions to meet those multiple requirements. Again, in order to reduce the overall number of questions, we combined all those requirements into short summaries or bulleted lists and reduced several questions to yes or no certifications. Next slide, please. We had heard from many tribal lead agencies and administrators that the question about the consumer statement elements was often confusing. You might remember that it originally had a lot of checkboxes, and it seemed like those were optional, but they actually were all requirements. So to correct that miscommunication, they were summarized in a bulleted list, and the question was then reduced to a yes or a no certification. And the other 2 consumer statement questions were removed from the draft plan preprint. So that takes us to the end of the plan preprint sections, but it's not the end of the plan though. I'll turn it over to Trina to further share refinements in the appendices.
Thank you, Patty. And yes, we do have some additions and information that we want to share. So we're going to go into the next slide. The next slide, as you can see, is related to child counts. So we know that tribes must submit a child count every 3 years to be eligible to receive Child Care and Development Funds, CCDF funds. The final FFY 2026-2028 Triennial Child Count Program Instruction, we know is published on July 2nd and is now available on OCC's website. And I believe that there's going to be a link in the chat. This PI provides guidance for direct funded tribes and tribes that have consolidated their plan into an approved Public Law 102477 plan. OCC released the PI early based on specific feedback we received through our RFI last year, where many tribes and tribal lead agencies asked for more time to complete the child count and more intensive TA. So we hope with this early release that tribal lead agents will be able to receive more targeted and timely support to complete their child count. Also, the Child Care Automated Reporting System, known as CARS, submission site will be open in early 2025 to allow tribes to begin entering their child count submission. We also want to point out that while questions are included in the plan document, they are considered final for FFY 2026 through 2028. Any comments received will be used for future submissions. So we're going to go to the next slide. We also want you to know that there is an added option for the child count declaration that has also the child count declaration also will be used as the demonstration to consortium membership. So that is also one of the changes to the child count declaration, demonstration and declaration. And so we're going to go to the next slide. So we also want you to know that the Tribal Early Learning Initiative, known as TELI, opportunity will be open again during this plan cycle. So you will see that in Appendix 2 in the draft plan. So we definitely wanted to let you all know that. And so now I have finished the appendices, and we're going to turn it over to Merle.
Thanks, Trina. So we have mentioned CARS a couple of times, and we do want to mention again that CARS will be the system where you submit your plan due July 1, 2025, so almost a year from now. And that is also for the child count, which is part of the plan. CARS, we know last year's plan, it was the first time we had a plan submission in CARS. There were some bumps, but it has really, I think, streamlined processes, both within OCC, with our work directly with tribal lead agencies, in terms of our review, our communication, and our approval. So we're really excited that we're able to use it again. It also provides a nice place to be able to store all of the plans for easy access, both by you all, tribal lead agencies, as well as OCC. It is a system of record that you can easily find information on your plan. So we will continue using it. When we go to the next slide. Thank you. So we know we were talking mostly about the plan draft today, but we didn't want to leave you without ensuring you that once the plan is final, you will be supported. We have lots of plans for training and technical assistance, including a child count national webinar this summer or fall 2024. Our TA provider TCBC will be holding that, as well as they've been working on other supports, other resources for you all on the child count. Because we are able to get the PI out early, we can be providing that support early. And please reach out to your regions if you have any questions or you need support on that. Once we do have a final plan in early 2025, we are planning some training. So we will have a CARS training once the CARS module is open. It won't, once the plan is final in January, CARS will not be open then. There'll be a little lag, but as soon as it is open, we will have a training for you. We also are planning several in-person preprint trainings similar to the last round. So as folks are also planning their budgets for this year, we want you all to know that we are planning those to be in person. Do not know the locations or dates, but as soon as we have that, we will share that with you. We can go to the next slide. So we've gone over a lot today, and we will be sharing, we will be able to share this webinar as well as the slides with you all once they're able to be on the website. But what we really would like you all to do now that you're kind of oriented to our new vision for the plan is to review the draft of the plan and then provide comments by emailing the email address on the screen by September 3rd. We have made a lot of changes, and as we said, we want to see like, what did we get right? What didn't we? What changes do we still need to make? We still have 2 more drafts until it is final. And so we are really looking to you as experts in your programs, your expertise in filling out previous plans, or even if it's your first time, please let us know. We do take all of those comments into consideration for the next draft. If you have any questions, the best place to go is your regional program manager, your regional program specialists, but you also can send an email to the OCC Tribal mailbox that goes to central office, and we can answer any questions on the plan during this comment period. But really encouraging you all to look through it and let us know, because we want to make sure that it works for you, that we took the feedback you gave us and implemented it in a way that that works. So I will go, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, So, as we've said, we've had a lot of OCC announcements that have come out over the past couple of weeks. And so we wanted to make sure there wasn't confusion. And so I did want to touch briefly on the announcement. We can go to the next slide that came out earlier this week about a new notice of proposed rulemaking. So earlier this week, we put out an announcement that we have a new notice of proposed rulemaking. This regulatory change would allow all tribal nations to make all Indian children, as defined in your plan by the tribal lead agency, residing in their CCDF service area, eligible for childcare services regardless of a family's income or assets. Right now, tribes with medium and large allocations cannot serve families with income over 85% of the grantee median income, except in limited circumstances, or unless they demonstrate that they are eligible to implement categorical eligibility. This proposed change would reduce the burden of demonstrating the low income status of their tribe every 3 years for categorical eligibility. Tribes with small allocations can already serve all families regardless of income. This proposed change would mean tribes would no longer be required to terminate a family who has a permanent increase of income above 85% of grantee median income, or turn families away who are above the maximum income eligibility threshold, or would allow a family who received a raise during their eligibility period to requalify for childcare services at redetermination or reapplication. Removing this family income limitation would enable tribes to serve all children and families to better meet childcare needs of their nations and communities, would support tribal sovereignty. It would support the tribe's ability to set income eligibility above 85% grantee median income if they choose, and would allow tribes to have a Head Start or another early learning program align the eligibility criteria. You can go to the next slide, please. So the NPRM is available to review on the Federal Register at this link, and I think it'll be put in the chat. You can begin submitting comments on Tuesday, July 16th. On this new rule. All comments must be submitted by September 16th in order to be considered. Comments must be submitted through regulation.gov, and there are instructions at the web link. The NPRM comment period is different from the tribal preprint, so we wanted to also be clear about that. They do overlap, but the NPRM only has one comment period. And you also might remember this from the NPRM OCC posted in July 2023 that OCC staff cannot answer any questions about the NPRM. If you have questions about the proposal or something is unclear, please submit that as a comment so we know to clarify it when we publish the final rule. And I'll also say, if you have questions about the preprint, staff would be able to answer those questions. Just with the NPRM, we just can't answer any questions. In addition to the public comment period, OCC will host a virtual consultation for tribal leaders in August, and we'll be sending an invitation letter out to tribal leaders next week about that information. And more information about the NPRM and comment period will be included in an OCC announcement next week. So please be on the lookout for that. We can go to the next slide. We just also wanted to have a special thank you to the National Center on Child Care Program Support. Shar was representing that center on today's call, but they really have been working tirelessly over the past several months, taking our conversations and putting it into a draft. And we would not have made progress, we wouldn't have gotten here without their support. So really want to thank them for all of their hard work. And with that, we want to thank you for attending today. And please review the plan and please provide comments. I think I've said that many times, but we really, really, truly need your input to make sure that this draft is responsive and works for you as well. So thank you.